The courtroom smelled of old wood and stale coffee. Captain Ethan Graves sat at the defense table, his dress blues pressed sharp enough to cut glass, his silver star gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Beside him, beneath the heavy oak table, lay his service dog, a Belgian Malinois named Ranger with a coat the color of burned caramel and eyes that never stopped scanning for threats. Ethan's hands rested flat on the polished surface, steady despite the tremor that lived in his bones since Kandahar. His attorney, a young JAG officer named Lieutenant Sarah Chen, he winced internally at the irony of her assignment to his case, shuffled papers nervously. Across the aisle, the prosecutor stood with the confidence of a man who'd never doubted his own righteousness. "Captain Graves," the prosecutor began, his voice echoing off the gallery walls, "you stand accused of dereliction of duty, falsifying military records, and conduct unbecoming an officer. How do you plead?" Ethan's jaw tightened. 16 years of service, 3 combat deployments, a Silver Star for valor, and now this, accused by his own commanding officer of crimes he didn't commit. "Not guilty, sir." The prosecutor smiled thinly. "We'll see about that." The military judge entered, Colonel Diane Foster, a woman whose reputation for fairness was matched only by her intolerance for procedural games. She was in her late 40s, with steel-gray hair cut military short and eyes that had seen too many courtrooms filled with broken soldiers. "Be seated," she said curtly, settling behind the bench. She glanced at the case file, then at Ethan. Something flickered across her face, recognition, curiosity, but it vanished before he could read it. Ranger shifted beneath the table, his warm weight pressing against Ethan's boot. The dog sensed his anxiety, the spike in cortisol that came with enclosed spaces and hostile faces. Ethan's hand dropped instinctively to scratch behind Ranger's ear, finding comfort in the familiar texture of fur and loyalty. "The prosecution may present its opening statement," Colonel Foster said. The prosecutor stood, buttoning his jacket with theatrical precision. "Your Honor, this case is simple. Captain Graves falsified maintenance logs for his unit's vehicles to cover up negligence that resulted in a training accident. 3 soldiers were injured. 1 nearly died. When confronted by Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb, the accused became insubordinate and aggressive, leading to his immediate relief of command." Ethan's fingers curled into fists. Webb. The name alone made his blood pressure spike. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb, his former commanding officer, a man who'd built his career on stolen valor and political connections, who ran their forward operating base like a personal fiefdom. Webb sat in the gallery, watching with cold satisfaction. He was 43 but looked older, his face lined with bitterness and ambition. His uniform was immaculate, his posture perfect, his eyes dead. The prosecutor continued, painting Ethan as a reckless officer who'd cut corners and endangered lives. The words were lies, but they were well-constructed lies, supported by doctored documents and coached witnesses. When the opening statement ended, Lieutenant Chen stood. Her hands shook slightly as she adjusted her notes. "Your Honor, the defense will show that Captain Graves is a decorated officer with an impeccable record. The evidence against him has been fabricated by Lieutenant Colonel Webb, who has a documented history of targeting subordinates who question his judgment." Colonel Foster's eyebrow raised slightly. "That's a serious allegation, counsel." "We have proof, Your Honor." "Then I look forward to seeing it." The first witness was called, a mechanic from Ethan's unit, a specialist named Rodriguez. The young man looked terrified as he took the stand, his eyes avoiding Ethan's. "Specialist Rodriguez," the prosecutor began smoothly, "you were responsible for maintaining vehicle logs under Captain Graves's command, correct?" "Yes, sir." "And did Captain Graves ever instruct you to falsify those logs?" Rodriguez hesitated. In that pause, Ethan saw everything: the fear, the coercion, the late-night meetings with Webb. The kid had been threatened, probably with a court-martial of his own. "Yes, sir," Rodriguez whispered. "He told me to mark vehicles as operational even when they weren't." Ethan's heart sank. The lie was perfect because it was half true. He had pushed vehicles to their limits, had made judgment calls about what was mission critical and what could wait. But he'd never falsified records. Ranger growled softly, sensing Ethan's distress. The sound was barely audible, but Colonel Foster's eyes flicked to the dog. For a moment their gazes met, Ethan and the judge, and something unspoken passed between them. She didn't know it yet, but Colonel Diane Foster owed her life to the man sitting before her. And the dog at his feet. Part 2, the mission that changed everything. 3 months earlier, Forward Operating Base Sentinel, Afghanistan. The sandstorm hit without warning, turning the Afghan sky into a churning wall of amber fury. Ethan stood in the motor pool, grease up to his elbows, shouting orders over the howling wind as his mechanics worked frantically to secure vehicles before the storm buried them. "Rodriguez, get that tarp secured. Mitchell, move those fuel drums inside." Lieutenant Colonel Webb emerged from the command building, his uniform somehow still pristine despite the chaos. He strode toward Ethan with the purposeful gait of a man about to make someone's life difficult. "Graves," Webb's voice cut through the wind. "I need a convoy ready to roll in 30 minutes. Ethan straightened, wiping grit from his face. "Sir, visibility's less than 10 meters. The storm." "I don't care about the storm. General Patterson's staff vehicle broke down at Checkpoint Bravo. He needs a replacement, and you're going to provide it." "With respect, sir, sending vehicles out in this is suicide. The roads will be." "That wasn't a request, Captain. It was an order." Webb's eyes were flat, emotionless. "Unless you're refusing a direct order from your commanding officer." The threat hung between them, sharp as a knife. Ethan had served under Webb for 8 months, and in that time he'd watched 3 good officers get quietly destroyed for challenging the man's judgment. Webb was untouchable. His father was a senator, his uncle a 4-star general. "No, sir," Ethan said finally. "I'll have a vehicle ready." Webb smiled without warmth. "Good. Make sure it's one of the newer Humvees. Can't have the general's staff riding in rust buckets." After Webb walked away, Ethan turned to his senior mechanic, Sergeant First Class Daniels, a grizzled veteran with 20 years under his belt. "Check Vehicle 7. If it's not 100%, I'm not sending it out." Daniels shook his head. "7's got a transmission issue. Been waiting on parts for 2 weeks." "What about Vehicle 12? "Brake system's soft. I wouldn't trust it in clear weather, let alone this." Ethan looked at the row of Humvees, calculating. Every vehicle had issues, not because of negligence, but because they were running a skeleton maintenance crew in a combat zone where supply lines were unreliable and demands were relentless. He made the call that would later destroy his career. "We'll send Vehicle 9. It's got minor electrical issues but nothing that affects safety. Log it as fully operational for the mission." It was a judgment call, the kind officers made every day in combat zones. Vehicle 9 was safe enough for a short convoy in bad weather. The alternative was refusing Webb's order and facing court-martial. The convoy rolled out 30 minutes later. Ethan watched the taillights disappear into the brown murk, Ranger pressed against his leg, both of them tense with unease. The radio crackled 2 hours later. "Base, this is Convoy Actual. Vehicle 9 just lost power. We're dead in the water, 10 clicks from Checkpoint Bravo." Ethan's blood ran cold. "Convoy Actual, what's your situation?" "Electrical systems completely fried. We're sitting ducks out here." Before Ethan could respond, Webb snatched the radio from his hand. "Convoy Actual, you have flares." "Affirmative, sir, but..." "Pop smoke and hunker down. We'll send recovery when the storm clears." "Sir, that could be hours. We're taking incoming fire." Webb switched off the radio. He turned to Ethan with cold fury. "You sent out a defective vehicle." "Sir, that vehicle was cleared for." "You nearly killed 4 soldiers and embarrassed me in front of the general's staff. I want every maintenance log from the past 6 months on my desk by 0600 tomorrow. Every single one." Ethan knew what was coming. Webb would comb through those logs looking for discrepancies, for any decision that could be twisted into negligence. That night, Ethan sat in his quarters with Ranger curled at his feet, reviewing the logs. Everything was accurate, but Webb didn't need actual evidence, just enough ambiguity to build a case. "We're in trouble, boy," Ethan murmured, stroking Ranger's head. The dog looked up at him with absolute trust, tail thumping once against the floor. The next morning, Webb filed charges. By afternoon, Ethan was relieved of command and confined to base pending investigation. Rodriguez and 2 other mechanics were called in for interviews that lasted hours. Within a week, the story had been constructed. Captain Graves had systematically falsified maintenance records to make his numbers look good, prioritizing his career over soldier safety. The evidence was circumstantial but damning. Signatures that looked forged, logs with suspicious timing, statements from terrified subordinates who'd been coached on what to say. Ranger never left Ethan's side during those dark weeks. The dog sensed his handler's spiraling anxiety, the nightmares that returned with a vengeance, the tremor in Ethan's hands that made shaving difficult. "I didn't do it," Ethan whispered into Ranger's fur one night, when the walls of his quarters felt like they were closing in. "I swear I didn't." Ranger licked his face, a warm rasp of unconditional belief. Now, sitting in the courtroom listening to Rodriguez perjure himself, Ethan wondered if loyalty and truth were enough to survive military justice, or if Webb's reach was long enough to bury them both. Part 3: The Storm's Eye. The testimony dragged through the afternoon like a convoy through mud. Specialist Rodriguez was followed by 2 more witnesses, both mechanics from Ethan's unit, both with the same haunted look of men who'd been given impossible choices. Sergeant Mitchell testified that Ethan had pressured him to sign off on repairs that weren't completed. Corporal Hayes claimed he'd witnessed Ethan altering digital maintenance logs late at night. All lies, all delivered in monotone voices that barely concealed the terror underneath. Lieutenant Chen did her best to poke holes in their stories, but the prosecutor had prepared them well. Every answer was rehearsed, every detail aligned with Webb's narrative. Colonel Foster watched it all with an unreadable expression, occasionally taking notes, her pen moving across paper in sharp, decisive strokes. She'd glance at Ethan periodically, and each time he met her gaze with the steady calm of a man who'd faced worse than courtrooms. Ranger remained motionless beneath the table, a statue of controlled alertness. Only his ears moved, swiveling to track every voice, every footstep. The dog was trained to detect threats, and right now, every person in this room except Ethan registered as potential danger. During the afternoon recess, Lieutenant Chen pulled Ethan into a side conference room. Her confidence from the morning had evaporated, replaced by barely concealed panic. "They're destroying us," she said, packing. "Every witness is aligned. The logs support their version. We need something concrete, Captain, or you're going to prison." Ethan leaned against the wall, arms crossed. Webb coached them, probably threatened them with their own court-martials if they didn't play along. "I believe you, but believing you doesn't help. We need proof." "There's one person who knows the truth," Ethan said quietly. "Webb's driver, Private First Class Morgan. She was with him during some of those interview sessions. If we could get her to talk." Chen shook her head. "She's on leave. Flew back to the States 2 days before the trial started. Convenient timing." Webb made sure she wouldn't be available. "So what do we do?" Ethan looked down at Ranger, who sat perfectly still, watching him with those intelligent amber eyes. The dog had been with him through 3 deployments, had pulled him out of a burning vehicle in Kandahar, had learned to sense his panic attacks before they happened, and ground him with pressure therapy. "We tell the truth," Ethan said, "all of it, no matter how it looks." Chen's expression softened with something like pity. "Captain, sometimes the truth isn't enough in a military court. Sometimes it's about who has the better story, the better connections." "Then Webb's already won." "Not necessarily." Chen pulled out her tablet, scrolling through files. "I've been digging into Webb's history. There's a pattern: 3 officers relieved under his command in the past 5 years, all accused of similar infractions, all cases that resulted in convictions or resignations rather than prolonged trials. He's done this before. Multiple times, but none of those officers had the resources to fight back properly. They took plea deals or resigned quietly. You're different. You have a silver star, a combat record that's spotless. If we can show this is part of a pattern of abuse." Ethan felt a flicker of hope. "Can you get those case files?" "Already requested them, but the prosecution will fight the motion. They'll argue prior cases aren't relevant to your specific charges." "Try anyway." When court resumed, the prosecution called their final witness, Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb himself. Webb took the stand with the bearing of a man who'd never been wrong in his life. His uniform was perfect, his ribbons displayed in precise alignment. He looked every inch the ideal officer. The prosecutor led him through a careful recitation of Ethan's failures: the falsified logs, the dangerous decisions, the insubordinate attitude when confronted. "Lieutenant Colonel Webb," the prosecutor asked, "in your professional opinion, was Captain Graves fit for command?" Webb's expression was sorrowful, like a disappointed father. "It pains me to say this, but no. Captain Graves is a decorated soldier with an impressive combat record. However, under the pressures of command, he made choices that endangered his unit. When I attempted to address these issues through proper channels, he became defensive and hostile." "Can you describe that hostility?" "He raised his voice during a counseling session, used profanity. His service dog," Webb gestured dismissively toward Ranger, "became aggressive, growling at me. I felt physically threatened." Ethan's hands clenched beneath the table. Ranger had never been aggressive except when protecting Ethan from genuine threats. The dog sensed bad intentions the way other animals sense storms. "What happened after that confrontation?" the prosecutor continued. "I had no choice but to relieve Captain Graves of command and initiate an investigation. The safety of our soldiers had to come first." Lieutenant Chen stood for cross-examination. Her hands no longer shook. "Lieutenant Colonel Webb, how many officers have you relieved under your command?" Webb's eyes narrowed. "That's not relevant to." "Please answer the question." "3 besides Captain Graves." 4 officers in 5 years. That seems like an unusual number, doesn't it? "I hold my subordinates to high standards." "Or perhaps you target competent officers who question your judgment." Chen pulled up a document on her tablet. "Captain Graves filed 3 safety reports in the month before his relief, all regarding mission decisions you made. Correct?" Webb's jaw tightened. "He filed complaints, yes. All were reviewed and found to be without merit." "Reviewed by whom?" "By me. I'm the commanding officer." "So you investigated complaints about yourself and found yourself blameless. Convenient." "Objection," the prosecutor called. "Argumentative." "Sustained," Colonel Foster said, but her gaze had sharpened, focusing on Webb with new intensity. Chen pressed forward. "Lieutenant Colonel, where were you on the night of February 14th? The question seemed to come from nowhere. Webb blinked, momentarily off balance. "I was at the base." "Why?" "You're certain?" "Yes." Chen pulled out another document. "According to radio logs, you left the base that evening on a personal convoy. Is that correct? Webb's composure cracked slightly. I had business at regional headquarters. In the middle of a sandstorm. The storm wasn't that severe when I departed. Colonel Foster leaned forward. Counsel, where is this line of questioning leading? Chen met her gaze. Your Honor, I'm establishing that Lieutenant Colonel Webb has a history of making reckless decisions and then blaming subordinates when those decisions go wrong. On February 14th, he ordered a convoy during dangerous conditions, the same behavior he's now accusing Captain Graves of. The courtroom went silent. Webb's face had gone red, his hands gripping the witness stand. That's a lie, he said, his voice tight with fury. I followed all proper protocols. Did you? Chen pulled up radio transcripts. Because these logs show you personally overrode safety recommendations from your operations officer. Objection, the prosecutor shouted. This is a witch hunt, Your Honor. The defense is putting the witness on trial instead of defending their client. Colonel Foster considered this. Her eyes moved from Chen to Webb to Ethan. Ranger had risen slightly, his body tense, his gaze locked on Webb with an intensity that made the lieutenant colonel visibly uncomfortable. I'll allow it, the judge said finally, but keep it relevant, counsel. Chen nodded. Lieutenant Colonel Webb, did you threaten Specialist Rodriguez and other mechanics if they didn't testify against Captain Graves? Absolutely not. Then, why did 3 of them request transfers immediately after giving statements? I don't control transfer requests. But you do control their performance evaluations, their promotions, their entire careers. Webb's mask slipped further, if you're implying. I'm not implying anything. I'm stating facts. You've created a command climate of fear where subordinates are terrified to contradict you. Captain Graves was the first officer brave enough to formally challenge your decisions, and you destroyed him for it. The prosecutor was on his feet again, objecting loudly, but Ethan barely heard it. He was watching Colonel Foster, whose expression had shifted from neutral judgment to something harder, more personal. She was looking at Webb the way someone looks at a puzzle piece that's finally clicked into place, as if she'd seen this pattern before, as if she recognized the type of officer who wielded authority like a weapon. Court adjourned for the day with Webb still on the stand, his composure shattered, his testimony incomplete. As the gallery emptied, Ranger suddenly moved. The dog's ears pricked forward, his nose lifting to sample the air. He stared at Colonel Foster as she gathered her files and let out a soft, almost inaudible whine. The judge looked down at the dog. Their eyes met, woman and animal, and something passed between them. Recognition, memory. Colonel Foster's hand moved unconsciously to her left wrist, where a medical alert bracelet peeked out from beneath her uniform sleeve. Then she turned and walked out, leaving Ethan with the strange, unsettling feeling that this trial was about to become something much more complicated than military justice. Part 4: The Buried Truth. That evening, Ethan sat in his temporary quarters, a sparse room in the bachelor officers' quarters with cinder block walls and a window that looked out onto the parade ground. Ranger lay on the foot of his bed, chin resting on crossed paws, watching Ethan with quiet concern. Lieutenant Chen had called 30 minutes ago with news that should have felt like victory, but instead settled in his stomach like lead. Private First Class Morgan just contacted me, Chen had said, her voice tight with excitement. She's willing to testify. She says Webb threatened her, told her she'd be charged as an accessory if she didn't leave the country during the trial. That's witness tampering. It's better than that, it's a pattern. I've got 2 of the officers Webb previously relieved willing to give depositions. They're scared, but they're willing to talk. Then why do you sound worried? There'd been a pause. Because the prosecution just filed a motion to exclude all pattern evidence. They're arguing it's prejudicial, that Webb's prior command decisions aren't relevant to your specific charges. Will it work? Depends on Colonel Foster. She could rule either way. Now, Ethan stared at the file Chen had sent over, the cases of the 3 officers Webb had destroyed before him. Captain Lisa Holland, relieved for inappropriate fraternization that no one could prove. Lieutenant Michael Torres, charged with mishandling classified materials that somehow appeared in his personal locker during a surprise inspection. Major James Whitmore, accused of alcohol abuse after a single incident that multiple witnesses said never happened. All 3 had taken plea deals or resigned rather than face court-martial. All 3 had their careers ended by Marcus Webb. The pattern was clear. Webb targeted competent officers who questioned his authority, manufactured evidence, and used the military justice system as a weapon. He'd perfected the art of legal assassination. Ethan's phone buzzed, unknown number. He almost ignored it, then answered. Captain Graves, a woman's voice young and frightened. Speaking. This is Private First Class Morgan. Your lawyer gave me your number. I need to talk to someone before I testify. I'm listening. Lieutenant Colonel Webb called me today. Somehow he found out I contacted the defense. He said, her voice broke. He said if I testified against him, he'd make sure my younger brother gets flagged when he enlists next year. He knows people at MEPS. He can ruin my family. Ethan's hand tightened on the phone. Did you record the call? No, I was too scared to think. I don't know what to do. He's going to destroy me either way. Not if we expose him first. The pattern evidence won't matter if the judge excludes it. And even if she doesn't, it's my word against his. He's a lieutenant colonel. I'm just a PFC. Who's going to believe me? Ethan looked at Ranger, who had lifted his head, sensing the tension in the room. The dog's ears swiveled toward the door, not alerting to immediate danger, but aware of something outside the normal pattern. Private Morgan, Ethan said carefully, did Webb ever do anything that violated regulations beyond the witness intimidation? Anything we can prove independently? She hesitated. There was money. I drove him to meetings with a contractor from Kabul. They'd sit in the vehicle talking while I waited outside. I couldn't hear everything, but I heard amounts. Large amounts. And once Webb left an envelope on the seat. I moved it and it was full of cash, hundreds, maybe thousands of dollars. Ethan's breath caught. Bribery. I don't know, but it wasn't normal, and he was furious when he realized I'd touched it. Can you testify to that? I can try, but Captain, her voice dropped to a whisper, I'm terrified. Webb isn't just mean, there's something wrong with him. When he gets angry, his eyes go dead, like there's nothing human left. I think he'd actually hurt someone if he thought he could get away with it. After the call ended, Ethan sat in darkness, Ranger's warm bulk pressed against his leg. The dog's presence was the only thing keeping the familiar spiral of anxiety at bay, the tightness in his chest, the hyper-awareness of every sound, the sense that the walls were closing in. PTSD had taught him that danger could hide anywhere, could strike without warning. But this was different. This was a threat that wore a uniform and spoke the language of military law. His phone buzzed again. This time it was Chen, motion hearing tomorrow 800. Foster wants to address pattern evidence before trial continues. This is it. Ethan typed back. Morgan called. Webb threatened her family. She has information about possible bribery. 3 dots appeared, then disappeared, then appeared again. Finally, holy hell, that changes everything. But we need proof, not just testimony. Working on it, Ethan replied, though he had no idea how. He looked at Ranger. What do you think, boy? How do we catch a predator who's spent years perfecting his camouflage? The dog cocked his head, then did something unusual. He stood, walked to the door, and pawed at it. Not the frantic scratching of a dog needing to go outside, but a deliberate, insistent gesture. Ethan opened the door. Ranger trotted out into the hallway, then looked back, waiting. It was the same behavior he'd exhibited dozens of times in combat zones when he detected something his handler needed to see. "What is it?" Ranger led him down the hallway, past empty offices, to the building's side entrance. They stepped out into the cool evening air. The base was quiet, most personnel at dinner or in their quarters. Ranger stopped at the edge of the parking lot, nose lifted, sampling the air. Then he looked at Ethan and back toward the parking lot, where a black sedan sat under a burned-out streetlight. Ethan's combat instincts kicked in. Something was wrong. That vehicle didn't belong, civilian plates, tinted windows, parked in a spot that gave a clear view of the BOQ entrance. Surveillance. He pulled out his phone and took photos, capturing the plates and the vehicle from multiple angles. As he did, the sedan's engine started. Headlights flared to life and it pulled away smoothly, disappearing into the evening traffic. But Ethan had seen the driver's silhouette, military posture, short haircut, someone Webb had sent to watch him. Back in his room, Ethan forwarded the photos to Chen with a message. "Webb's having me watched. He knows we're building a case." Her response came immediately. "Stay in your quarters. Don't go anywhere alone. If Webb's this desperate, he's dangerous." Ethan sat on his bed, Ranger's head in his lap. The dog's breathing was steady, calm, grounding, but Ethan's mind was racing. Webb had built his predatory system carefully, identifying vulnerable targets, manufacturing evidence, using fear to control witnesses. But he'd made one mistake. He'd underestimated a decorated combat veteran with nothing left to lose. And he'd underestimated the dog, who'd learned to smell danger before it struck. Tomorrow would be the turning point. The motion hearing would determine whether the pattern evidence could be presented, whether Webb's past victims could finally be heard. But tonight, sitting in the dark with his loyal companion, Ethan made a decision. If the military justice system failed him, if Webb's connections and manipulations proved too strong, he wouldn't go down quietly. He'd make sure the truth came out, one way or another. Ranger sensed the shift in his handler's determination. The dog's tail thumped once against the floor, a gesture of solidarity, of absolute trust. They'd faced enemy fire together. They'd survived explosions and ambushes and the special hell of combat zones. They could survive this too. They had to. Part 5: The Witness. The motion hearing began precisely at 0800 hours. The courtroom felt different today, the air thick with anticipation, the gallery more crowded. Word had spread that something significant was happening in the Graves court-martial. Colonel Foster entered, and Ethan noticed immediately that she looked tired. There were shadows under her eyes, and she moved with the careful deliberation of someone fighting pain. Her left hand trembled slightly as she arranged papers on the bench. Ranger noticed too. The dog's ears pricked forward, his body going still in that particular way that meant he'd detected something important. His gaze locked on the judge with an intensity that made Ethan uneasy. "Counsel," Foster said, her voice crisp despite the fatigue, "I've reviewed both motions regarding pattern evidence. This is an unusual request, and I want to hear arguments before ruling." The prosecutor stood, confident as ever. "Your Honor, the defense wants to put Lieutenant Colonel Webb's entire career on trial. They want to parade a series of disgruntled former subordinates to smear a decorated officer's reputation. This is character assassination, not defense strategy. The rules of evidence are clear. Prior acts aren't admissible to prove propensity." Lieutenant Chen rose. "Your Honor, this isn't about propensity. It's about modus operandi. Lieutenant Colonel Webb has a specific, documented pattern. He targets capable officers who question his judgment, manufactures evidence against them, intimidates witnesses, and uses the military justice system to eliminate threats to his authority. Captain Graves is the fourth victim of this pattern. The prior cases are directly relevant to proving this isn't an isolated incident. It's Webb's standard operating procedure. Foster leaned back, wincing slightly. Do you have documentary evidence of this pattern or just testimony? Both, Your Honor. We have sworn depositions from 2 of the 3 prior officers. Service records showing the timing of their reliefs correlates with safety complaints they filed. And we have a witness, Private First Class Morgan, who can testify to Webb's explicit threats against anyone who challenges him. The prosecutor scoffed. Private Morgan is a disgruntled soldier who— Private Morgan, Chen interrupted, her voice sharp, was threatened by Lieutenant Colonel Webb just yesterday. He told her that if she testified, he would ruin her brother's military career before it even started. That's felony witness tampering, Your Honor. It goes directly to Webb's pattern of using fear and intimidation. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Foster's eyes narrowed. Counsel, do you have evidence of this threat? We have Private Morgan's sworn statement and her testimony, which we're prepared to present today. Foster looked at the prosecutor. Does the government have a response? The prosecutor's confidence had cracked slightly. Your Honor, we weren't informed that Private Morgan would be testifying. This is trial by ambush. This is a motion hearing, not the trial proper, Foster cut him off. I'll allow it. Bring in Private Morgan. The courtroom doors opened, and a young woman in Army combat uniform entered. Private First Class Sarah Morgan was 22, with auburn hair pulled back in a regulation bun and eyes that darted nervously around the room. She walked to the witness stand as if approaching a minefield. When her gaze landed on Lieutenant Colonel Webb, sitting ramrod straight in the gallery, she visibly paled. Webb stared back with cold intensity, his expression a silent threat. Ranger growled low, barely audible but unmistakable. Ethan's hand dropped to the dog's collar, steadying him. The Malinois' hackles had risen slightly, his body coiled with tension. He was reacting to something, some threat signal that humans couldn't detect. Foster's eyes flicked to the dog, then to Webb, then back to Morgan. Private, please state your name and duty station for the record. Private First Class Sarah Morgan, 3rd Battalion, 15th Infantry. Her voice was thin, shaky. Chen stood. Private Morgan, you served as Lieutenant Colonel Webb's driver for 6 months at Forward Operating Base Sentinel, correct? Yes, ma'am. During that time, did you witness Lieutenant Colonel Webb meeting with anyone unusual? Morgan swallowed hard. Yes, there was a contractor from Kabul, Mr. Khalid. They met 4 or 5 times, always away from the base, always private conversations while I waited in the vehicle. Did you ever hear what they discussed? Not most of it, but once. She glanced at Webb, whose expression had gone perfectly blank, the mask of a man who knew he was being watched. Once I heard amounts, large amounts, 50,000, 100,000, and Mr. Khalid laughed and said something about Americans always wanting more. The prosecutor shot to his feet. Objection, hearsay. This witness has no context for what she allegedly heard. It's not offered for the truth of the matter, Chen countered. It's offered to show that irregular meetings occurred, which corroborates the pattern of corruption we're establishing. Foster considered. I'll allow it, but cautiously. Continue, Private. There was one time, Morgan said, her voice gaining strength, when Lieutenant Colonel Webb left an envelope in the vehicle. I moved it to get to the radio, and it was full of cash, American hundreds. There had to be $10,000 or more. What did Lieutenant Colonel Webb do when he realized you'd seen it? Morgan's hands gripped the edge of the witness box. He grabbed my arm hard enough to bruise. He said that if I ever mentioned what I'd seen, I'd regret it. That he had friends in CID, friends in Army personnel, friends everywhere. That he could make me disappear. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Webb's lawyer, a civilian attorney who'd been sitting quietly, stood abruptly. Your Honor, this is outrageous. My client is not on trial here. Your client is a witness in this case, Foster snapped. He's subject to cross-examination regarding his credibility and character. Sit down." Chen pressed forward. "Private Morgan, did Lieutenant Colonel Webb contact you recently?" "Yes, ma'am. Yesterday, he called my cell phone." "What did he say?" Morgan's eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained steady. "He said he knew I'd talked to the defense. He said if I testified, he'd make sure my little brother gets flagged when he tries to enlist. My brother's been preparing for this his whole life. Webb said one phone call to the right people at MEPS, and my brother would never wear a uniform." "And did this threat affect your willingness to testify?" "Yes, I almost didn't come today. I'm terrified." She looked directly at Webb. "But I'm more terrified of what happens if officers like him keep getting away with it." The silence that followed was absolute. Foster's expression had shifted from judicial neutrality to something harder, more personal. Her hand moved unconsciously to her left wrist again, fingers touching the medical alert bracelet hidden beneath her sleeve. Ranger suddenly stood. Before Ethan could stop him, the dog moved out from under the defense table and walked directly toward the bench, not aggressively, but with the purposeful gait of a service animal responding to a crisis. "Bailiff," the prosecutor shouted, "control that animal." But Ranger ignored him. The dog approached Colonel Foster's bench, stood on his hind legs, and rested his front paws on the edge, exactly as he'd been trained to do when detecting a medical emergency. Foster looked down at the dog. Their eyes met, and something passed between them, a moment of recognition that made the judge's breath catch. "Easy," she murmured, her voice barely audible. Then louder, "It's okay. He's not threatening anyone." Ranger made a soft sound, almost a whine, and his nose pushed forward, sniffing the air near the judge's face. Then he did something that made Ethan's heart stop. The dog gently took Foster's left wrist in his mouth, not biting, but holding with the careful pressure of a trained medical alert dog, and tugged once. Foster stared at her wrist, at the medical bracelet now visible where Ranger's touch had pulled back her sleeve. The bracelet was engraved with text Ethan couldn't read from his position, but he saw Foster's face go white. She remembered. "Bailiff," Foster said quietly, "remove Lieutenant Colonel Webb from the courtroom. Now." "Your Honor," Webb's attorney protested, "you can't." "I can, and I am. Bailiff, if Lieutenant Colonel Webb resists, place him under arrest for contempt. This hearing is in recess for 15 minutes. As Webb was escorted out, his face purple with rage, his mouth opening to protest, Foster looked at Ethan. Really looked at him, seeing past the uniform and the charges to the man beneath. And then she looked at Ranger, who had returned to Ethan's side, tail wagging once in satisfaction. The judge's voice was barely a whisper, meant only for herself, but Ethan heard it. "It was you." Part 6, The Truth Unravels. The 15-minute recess stretched to 30. Colonel Foster had retired to her chambers without explanation, leaving the courtroom buzzing with speculation. Lieutenant Chen paced near the defense table, periodically glancing at her watch and muttering about mistrial procedures. Ethan sat perfectly still, Ranger's head resting on his knee, trying to piece together what had just happened. The judge's reaction when Ranger touched her medical bracelet, the recognition in her eyes, the whispered words, "It was you." "Captain Graves," the bailiff approached, his expression unreadable. "Colonel Foster wants to see you in chambers, you and your attorney, and," he looked down at Ranger, "the dog." Chen's eyes widened. "That's highly irregular." "Judge's orders, ma'am." They followed the bailiff through a side door and down a narrow hallway to a solid oak door marked Judge's Chambers. The bailiff knocked once and pushed it open. The office was sparse, government tissue furniture, law books lining the walls, a single photograph on the desk showing a younger version of Colonel Foster standing beside a man in Army uniform. Her late husband, Ethan guessed from the memorial bracelet on her wrist. Foster sat behind her desk, her judicial robes replaced with ACUs. She looked smaller without the robes, more human. And there was something in her expression, a mix of disbelief and recognition and carefully controlled emotion. "Sit," she said, gesturing to the chairs across from her desk. Then, looking at Ranger, "You too." The dog sat immediately, his attention focused on Foster with that same intensity he'd shown in the courtroom. "Captain Graves," Foster began, her voice carefully controlled, "I'm about to do something that could result in my removal from the bench. I'm going to share personal information that may compromise my impartiality in this case, but I believe it's necessary for justice to be served." Chen leaned forward. "Your Honor, with respect, if there's a conflict of interest." "There is, a significant one." Foster took a breath. 3 months ago, I was driving back from a conference at regional headquarters. There was a sandstorm, the worst I'd seen in 2 deployments. Visibility was almost zero. I shouldn't have been on the road, but I'd received an emergency message that my father was ill. I was trying to get to the airfield to catch a flight stateside. She paused, her fingers unconsciously touching the medical bracelet. My vehicle went off the road. The embankment was steeper than I realized. The Humvee rolled twice and ended up on its side, wedged against a boulder with the driver's side partially submerged in a runoff stream. Cold water, rising fast. Ethan's breath caught. He remembered that night. Remembered driving through the storm on an unauthorized convoy run to deliver medical supplies to a remote checkpoint. Remembered Ranger's sudden alert, the way the dog had gone rigid and started barking at the window. "I was trapped," Foster continued. "The door was jammed. Water was coming in. I couldn't get my seatbelt undone. My hands were too cold and I'd hit my head in the rollover. I was going into shock." Her voice wavered slightly. "I'd lost my husband 5 years ago in a similar accident. He died alone on a roadside because no one stopped. And I remember thinking with perfect clarity that I was going to die the same way." "Your Honor," Chen said softly, understanding dawning on her face. Then someone appeared at the window. A man in ACUs, covered in sand, shouting that he was going to get me out. He had a dog with him, a Belgian Malinois who somehow squeezed through the window and sat on my chest, keeping me warm, keeping me conscious while the man worked to pry the door open. Foster looked directly at Ethan. "It took you 20 minutes to get that door open. The entire time your dog never left my side, and the entire time your radio kept buzzing. I could hear your convoy calling you, asking where you were, saying you were going to be marked AWOL if you didn't respond." The pieces clicked into place. The convoy, the emergency supply run that was never officially authorized, the 3-hour delay that earned him a written reprimand for being late to Checkpoint Bravo. "When you finally got me out," Foster continued, "you wrapped me in an emergency blanket and got me to the road. You called for medevac, but before they arrived you did something that stayed with me. You took off this dog's vest," she gestured to Ranger, "and tucked it around me like a second blanket. You said, 'He's kept a lot of soldiers alive. Let him keep one more.'" "The medevac took you away," Ethan said quietly, the memory rushing back. "I never knew your name. They asked me to file a report, but by the time I got back to base, Lieutenant Colonel Webb had me in his office demanding to know why I'd violated convoy protocol." "Because you stopped to save a stranger." Foster's eyes glistened. "You sacrificed your clean record, took a reprimand, and gave up your security clearance privileges for 30 days, all to pull someone out of a wreck." Chen was staring at both of them. "Your Honor, this means I have a massive conflict of interest." Foster pulled a file from her desk drawer. "But it also means I understand something the prosecution doesn't. The night you saved me, Captain Graves, you had every reason to keep driving. You were on an unauthorized mission. You'd already been on Webb's radar for filing safety complaints, and stopping would guarantee you'd face consequences." She opened the file. "I've spent the last 3 days since this trial started reviewing every case that's come through my court in the past year. I'm ashamed to say I nearly missed it. I was so focused on procedure, on maintaining order, that I almost failed to see what was right in front of me. Webb, Ethan said. Lieutenant Colonel Webb has a pattern. Private Morgan's testimony confirmed it. He targets officers with integrity, officers who won't compromise on safety or ethics, officers like you, Captain Graves, officers who would stop on a sand-swept road to save a stranger even when it costs them everything. Foster stood, packing to the window. The evidence against you in this court-martial is fabricated. The logs were altered, the witnesses were coerced, and Webb planted that evidence knowing you were too honorable to adequately defend yourself without implicating your subordinates. Can you prove it? Chen asked. I can't, but you can. Foster pulled out another document, a printout of financial records. I made some calls, pulled some strings. Lieutenant Colonel Webb has been receiving payments from a contractor in Kabul, the same contractor Private Morgan mentioned. $50,000 deposited into an offshore account over the past year. Bribery, Ethan said. And fraud. The contractor was overbilling for services that were never provided. Webb was taking a cut to approve the invoices. When you started filing safety reports, Captain, you weren't just questioning his judgment. You were threatening to expose a corruption scheme that could send him to Leavenworth. Foster handed the documents to Chen. This is inadmissible in your trial. I obtained it through channels that wouldn't survive an evidence challenge, but it's enough to trigger a formal CID investigation. If we present this now, Chen said slowly, the trial becomes about Webb's corruption, not Graves's alleged negligence. Exactly. The prosecution's case falls apart when their key witness is under investigation for bribery and witness tampering. Ethan looked at Ranger, who sat calmly beside Foster's desk, tail thumping against the floor. The dog had known. From the moment they'd entered the courtroom, Ranger had recognized Foster, not visually, but through scent, through the memory of that night when he'd kept a dying woman warm while his handler worked to save her. Your Honor, Ethan said carefully, you're risking your career for this. No, Captain. I'm doing what you did 3 months ago, the right thing regardless of the cost. She smiled faintly. Besides, you gave me a second chance at life. The least I can do is help you keep yours. Chen was already on her phone, typing rapidly. I'm forwarding this to CID. They'll have agents here within the hour. Foster nodded. When we reconvene, I'm going to declare a mistrial. The conflict of interest is too significant for me to continue presiding, but I'm also going to recommend that all charges against Captain Graves be dropped pending the investigation into Lieutenant Colonel Webb. Webb will fight it, Ethan warned. Let him try. He's made enemies in every command he served in. Once CID starts digging, those enemies will come forward. Foster looked at Ranger again, her expression softening. And he made one crucial mistake. What's that? He underestimated a dog's memory. She knelt down and Ranger approached her, tail wagging. Foster scratched behind his ears, her voice thick with emotion. Thank you, boy, for keeping me alive that night, and for recognizing me today. Ranger licked her hand once, then returned to Ethan's side. A good soldier, mission complete. 2 hours later, the courtroom reconvened. Colonel Foster announced the mistrial, cited her conflict of interest, and recommended dismissal of all charges. The prosecutor tried to object, but 3 CID agents in the gallery stood up, flashing badges. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb, one of them announced, you're under investigation for bribery, fraud, and witness tampering. You're confined to quarters pending formal charges. Webb's face went from red to white. He looked at Ethan with pure hatred, then at Foster with something like disbelief. As the agents led him away, he spat one final threat. This isn't over. But it was. The truth had been his undoing. Part 7, Vindication. 3 weeks later, the full scope of Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb's corruption had been exposed like a wound, open to sunlight. The CID investigation, once triggered, had moved with the relentless efficiency of military justice when it finally focused on the right target. Webb's offshore accounts held over $200,000 in bribes. His contractor friend in Kabul had been overbilling the military for services by 40%, phantom repairs, ghost inventory, fabricated invoices, all approved by Webb in exchange for his cut. The scheme had been running for 3 years, funded by taxpayer dollars meant for soldier safety. But it was the paper trail of intimidation that sealed his fate. Private Morgan's testimony had opened a floodgate. Within days, 7 other soldiers came forward with stories of threats, coercion, and abuse. Specialists who'd been told their families would lose benefits if they didn't comply with false testimony. Junior officers who'd been promised career advancement in exchange for looking the other way. A pattern of predatory command that had operated unchecked, because Webb's connections had made him seem untouchable. Until one decorated captain, with a loyal dog, had refused to be destroyed quietly. Ethan stood in the conference room of the base's legal office, wearing his dress blues, waiting for the final formality. The charges against him had been officially dismissed with prejudice, meaning they could never be refiled. His record was being expunged of the relief of command notation. He was whole again, at least on paper. Lieutenant Chen sat across from him, looking far more confident than the terrified young lawyer who'd first taken his case. "The Army Times wants an interview," she said, smiling. "So does Stars and Stripes. You're going to be famous, Captain." "I don't want to be famous. I just want my command back." "You'll get it." General Patterson personally apologized. "He's reassigning you to 3rd Battalion. It's a promotion, actually. You'll be taking over as executive officer." Ethan nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. The victory felt hollow somehow. Webb would go to prison, probably 5 to 10 years in Leavenworth. But the soldiers he'd hurt, the careers he'd ruined, those wounds wouldn't heal just because justice had been served. Ranger sensed his handler's subdued mood. The dog pressed his shoulder against Ethan's leg, offering the steady comfort that had sustained them both through years of combat and now through a different kind of war. "Captain Graves." The conference room door opened, and Colonel Diane Foster entered. She was out of uniform today, wearing civilian clothes, a simple blouse and slacks. She looked younger without the weight of judicial authority on her shoulders. Chen stood immediately. "Your Honor, I mean Colonel Foster, I didn't know you'd be here." "I'm technically on leave while the ethics review completes," Foster explained. "But I wanted to see Captain Graves before I left." Chen glanced between them, sensing this was a private matter. "I'll give you two some space. Captain, I'll file the final paperwork this afternoon. You're officially cleared for duty." After Chen left, Foster sat down across from Ethan. Ranger immediately moved to her, resting his chin on her knee in a gesture of recognition and affection. She scratched behind his ears absently, her eyes on Ethan. "How are you holding up?" she asked. "Better than I have any right to be. You saved my career, ma'am, probably my life." "You saved mine first. I'd say we're even." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "The ethics review is mostly a formality. I'll likely receive a letter of counsel for not recusing myself earlier, but given the outcome, it won't affect my career. I'll be reassigned to another post, probably stateside." "I'm sorry the conflict cost you this assignment." Foster shook her head. "Don't be. What happened in that courtroom needed to happen. Webb needed to be stopped and you needed to be vindicated. If my career took a small hit to make that possible, it's a price I'd pay again." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Outside the windows, the base was alive with the ordinary rhythm of military life. Soldiers jogging in formation, vehicles moving between buildings, the distant sound of a loudspeaker announcing evening colors. "Can I ask you something?" Ethan said finally. "That night in the sandstorm when I pulled you out of the Humvee, Why were you out there alone? You said something about your father being ill." Foster's expression grew distant. He'd had a heart attack. The Red Cross message came through at 1700 hours. I should have waited for proper transport, but I'd lost my husband 5 years earlier and wasn't there when he died. The thought of losing my father the same way. She trailed off. I made an emotional decision that almost got me killed. But you lived. Because you stopped. Because your dog wouldn't let you drive past someone in trouble. She looked down at Ranger. He's remarkable, you know. The way he remembered me. The way he knew exactly when to intervene in that courtroom. He saved my life more times than I can count. In Kandahar, he pulled me out of a burning vehicle after an IED strike. During my worst PTSD episodes, he grounds me before the panic attack fully hits. He's more than a dog. He's my battle buddy. Foster smiled. He's your guardian angel with fur. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small package wrapped in brown paper. I wanted to give you this before I left. Ethan unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a leather collar, high quality, hand-tooled with military precision. Engraved on a brass plate were the words, Ranger Service Dog Medal of Honor Unofficial. I know the military doesn't give medals to dogs anymore, Foster said softly. But if they did, he'd deserve the highest honor. He saved us both, me in that sandstorm and you in that courtroom. Ethan's throat tightened. He knelt down and carefully removed Ranger's worn service collar, replacing it with the new one. The dog sat perfectly still, sensing the significance of the moment, his amber eyes moving between his two humans with patient intelligence. There's one more thing, Foster said. She pulled out an official-looking document. This is a commendation letter. I'm submitting it through proper channels, recommending you for the Soldier's Medal. What you did that night, stopping during an unauthorized convoy, risking your career to save a stranger, that's the definition of heroism. I was just doing what anyone should do. But not everyone would. That's what makes it heroic. She stood and Ethan rose with her. I need to go. My flight leaves in 3 hours, but Captain Graves, Ethan, I want you to know something. She paused, her voice thick with emotion. When my husband died, I lost faith in humanity. I saw his death as proof that people were fundamentally selfish, that in a crisis, everyone looks out for themselves. For 5 years, I carried that bitterness into my courtroom. I judged the world through the lens of that loss. And then you saved me. And your dog sat on my chest in a freezing sandstorm and refused to let me give up. You both reminded me that there are still people worth believing in. Ethan extended his hand, but Foster pulled him into a brief military-proper hug. Thank you, she whispered, for everything. After she left, Ethan stood alone in the conference room with Ranger. The dog looked up at him, tail wagging slowly, that expression of absolute loyalty and understanding that had sustained Ethan through the darkest moments of his life. We did good, didn't we, boy? Ranger barked once, a sharp affirmative sound, and his tail wagged harder. That evening, Ethan walked across the base to the 3rd Battalion headquarters. His new assignment began tomorrow, but he wanted to see the unit, get a feel for the command before he stepped into the executive officer role. The battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Reeves, met him at the entrance. She was in her mid-40s, with the weathered look of an officer who'd spent more time in the field than behind a desk. Her handshake was firm, her eyes sharp and assessing. Captain Graves, welcome to 3rd Battalion. I've read your file, all of it, including the trial transcripts. Ma'am, I want to assure you. Save it, Captain. I don't care about the accusations. I care about the verdict, innocent. And more importantly, I care about your record before Webb tried to destroy it. Silver Star, 3 combat deployments, exemplary efficiency reports. You're exactly the kind of officer this battalion needs. She led him through the headquarters building, past offices where staff officers worked late into the evening. Soldiers stood when they passed, offering crisp salutes that Ethan returned with equal precision. "We've had our own problems with toxic leadership," Reeves said bluntly. "Not as bad as Webb, but bad enough. I'm rebuilding the command climate here, and I need leaders who understand that integrity isn't negotiable. Your trial, your refusal to compromise even when it would have been easier, that's exactly the example these soldiers need to see." They stopped at an office marked XO Executive Officer. Reeves opened the door, revealing a modest space with a desk, filing cabinets, and a window overlooking the motor pool. "It's yours as of 0800 tomorrow. Get settled, get to know the staff, and don't let anyone tell you you're damaged goods because of what Webb put you through. In my battalion, we judge people by their actions, not by the lies told about them." Ethan felt the knot of tension he'd carried for months finally begin to loosen. "Thank you, ma'am. I won't let you down." "I know you won't. Your dog told me." "Ma'am." Reeves smiled. "Ranger, right? I met him when you checked in this morning. He sat perfectly still while I reviewed your orders, completely calm and professional. A dog doesn't have that kind of discipline unless his handler is worth following. I trust his judgment." After Reeves left, Ethan sat at his new desk. Ranger immediately claimed the corner of the office, circling twice before lying down with a contented sigh. The dog's message was clear: "This place is safe. We can rest here." Ethan pulled out his phone and scrolled through his messages. There was one from Captain Lisa Holland, one of Webb's previous victims, congratulating him on his vindication and thanking him for finally stopping the man who destroyed her career. There was another from Lieutenant Torres, expressing similar gratitude. The truth had vindicated them all. As the sun set outside his window, painting the motor pool in shades of gold and amber, Ethan felt something he hadn't felt in months: hope. The trial was over. The lies had been exposed. Justice, imperfect and delayed but ultimately real, had prevailed. He looked at Ranger, who had fallen asleep in his corner, paws twitching as he dreamed of whatever dogs dreamed about, probably squirrels, or perhaps that night in the sandstorm when he'd kept a dying woman warm. "We made it, boy," Ethan whispered. "We actually made it." Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new responsibilities, new chances to serve with honor. But tonight, in the quiet of his new office with his faithful companion beside him, Ethan Graves allowed himself to simply breathe. The battle was over. And they had won. Part 8, Full Circle. 6 months later. The autumn air in Virginia was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and wood smoke. Ethan stood on the porch of a small house just outside Joint Base Meyer-Henderson Hall, watching the sun rise over the distant monuments of Washington. D.C. Ranger sat beside him, grayer now around the muzzle but still alert, still watching the world with those intelligent amber eyes. Life in 3rd Battalion had been everything Lieutenant Colonel Reeves promised. The unit was solid, the soldiers professional, the command climate healthy. Ethan had thrown himself into the work, rebuilding trust with subordinates, mentoring young officers, ensuring that the toxic patterns he'd survived under Webb never took root in his new command. The nightmares had faded. The hypervigilance had eased. Ranger still performed his service dog duties when needed, but more often now, he was just a companion, a friend who'd seen the worst of war and chosen to remain loyal through everything that followed. Ethan's phone buzzed. A text from Colonel Foster, looking forward to today. See you at 1400. Today was special. After months of paperwork and ceremony, today Ethan would receive the Soldier's Medal in a formal ceremony at the Pentagon. The award recognized his actions that night in the sandstorm, the decision to stop, to risk his career, to save a stranger's life when everything in his situation screamed for him to keep driving. But more than the medal, today was about something else entirely. At 1300 hours, Ethan dressed in his dress blues, making sure every ribbon was perfectly aligned, every brass button polished to mirror brightness. Ranger wore his new collar, the one Foster had given him, and a small service vest that marked him as more than a pet. They drove to the Pentagon, that massive concrete fortress that housed the heart of American military power. The ceremony was small, intimate, held in one of the building's interior courtyards rather than a public auditorium. Foster had insisted on keeping it quiet, away from the media attention that had followed the trial. The attendees were few but meaningful. Lieutenant Colonel Reeves, representing 3rd Battalion. Lieutenant Chen, who'd fought so hard to defend him. Private First Class Morgan, who'd found the courage to speak truth to power. And sitting in the front row, wearing civilian clothes but carrying herself with unmistakable military bearing, Colonel Diane Foster. The presiding officer was a 2-star general Ethan didn't know personally, General Patricia Morrison, Deputy Commander of Forces Command. She read the citation with the crisp authority of someone who understood that medals weren't just metal and ribbon, but recognition of moments when ordinary people chose to be extraordinary. Captain Ethan Graves repeatedly distinguished himself by heroism, not involving actual conflict with an armed enemy. On February 14th, while conducting an unauthorized convoy mission during hazardous weather conditions, Captain Graves discovered a military vehicle that had rolled off the road during a sandstorm. Despite knowing that stopping would result in disciplinary action and jeopardize his career, Captain Graves immediately rendered aid, working for 20 minutes in dangerous conditions to extract a trapped soldier. His actions unquestionably saved the life of Colonel Diane Foster, who had gone into hypothermic shock. Captain Graves's selfless service and complete dedication to saving a fellow soldier, at great personal risk and professional cost, reflect great credit upon himself, the United States Army, and the Department of Defense. General Morrison pinned the medal to Ethan's chest, a bronze medallion suspended from a ribbon of blue and red stripes. It was one of the Army's highest peacetime awards for valor, and as the general stepped back to salute him, Ethan felt the weight of it, not the physical weight, but the moral weight of being recognized for simply doing what he knew was right. The small gathering applauded. Ranger, sitting perfectly at attention beside Ethan, let out one soft bark, his own form of approval. After the ceremony, as attendees mingled over coffee and conversation, Foster approached Ethan. She moved with more ease now, the lingering effects of her injuries finally healed. The medical bracelet was still on her wrist, but it no longer seemed like a burden, more like a reminder of second chances. "Congratulations," she said, shaking his hand formally before pulling him into a brief hug. "You deserve this. You deserved it 6 months ago, but I'm glad it happened." "I'm just glad the truth came out." "Webb's sentencing hearing is next week," Foster said quietly. "CID estimates he'll get 7 years, possibly more if they can prove the extent of the fraud. And the 3 officers whose careers he destroyed are all being offered reinstatement with back pay. Justice delayed but not denied." "Exactly." She looked down at Ranger, who had immediately pressed himself against her leg, seeking the attention she willingly gave. "How's he doing?" "He's good, getting older, slowing down a bit, but still sharp. The vet says he's got a few more good years in him." "I'm glad." Foster's expression grew more serious. "I wanted to talk to you about something. I've been thinking about what happened, the trial, the investigation, everything that came after. And I've realized something important." "What's that?" "The military justice system works, but only when people are willing to fight for it. When people like you refuse to accept injustice quietly. When people like Private Morgan find the courage to speak truth even when it's terrifying. When people like Lieutenant Chen work tirelessly for clients they barely know." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "I've been offered a position at the JAG school in Charlottesville. They want me to develop new training protocols for military judges, specifically how to recognize and address toxic command climates and corruption in the ranks. I accepted. That's important work. It is, and I'm hoping you'll help me. Ethan raised an eyebrow. How? Guest lectures. Your case is going to be a teaching example, not because you were accused, but because you survived the accusation with your integrity intact. Future JAG officers need to understand what it looks like when the system is weaponized, and what it takes to defend against it. I'm not sure I'm the right person. You're exactly the right person. You lived it. You understand both sides, the accused and the falsely accused. You know what it's like when everything is stacked against you and the only thing you have left is the truth. Ethan looked at Ranger, who gazed back with that expression of infinite patience and wisdom. The dog had been there through everything: the combat deployments, the false accusations, the trial, the vindication. If Ranger could keep faith through all of that, Ethan could find the courage to share his story. "Okay," he said finally, "I'll do it." Foster's smile was radiant. "Thank you. This is going to help so many people." Later that evening, Ethan drove back to his small house in Virginia. The medal sat in its presentation case on the passenger seat, next to Ranger's head. The dog dozed peacefully, occasionally twitching in his sleep, dreaming whatever dreams sustained faithful companions. As Ethan pulled into his driveway, he noticed someone sitting on his porch steps. For a brief moment, his combat instincts kicked in: threat assessment, hand moving toward the door lock. Then he recognized the figure: Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Reeves, out of uniform, holding a bottle of wine. "I hope you don't mind unexpected visitors," she said as Ethan approached. "I figured you could use some company after a day like today." "I don't mind at all, ma'am." "Sarah, we're off duty." She held up the wine. "I brought a cheap bottle of red and an expensive sense of pride in my executive officer. Figured we could celebrate properly." They sat on the porch as the sun set, not talking about the medal or the trial or the military. Just two soldiers sharing war stories, laughing about the absurdities of Army life, finding common ground in the shared experience of service. Ranger eventually joined them, his massive head resting on Sarah's knee. She scratched behind his ears absently, the gesture of someone comfortable around military working dogs. "You know what I admire most about you," Sarah said after her second glass of wine. "You didn't let them break you. Webb tried to destroy your career, your reputation, your spirit, and you just refused to break." "I had help," Ethan said, looking at Ranger. "Couldn't have survived without him." "Maybe, but plenty of people have service dogs and still fall apart when the pressure gets too intense. You're strong because you chose to be, because somewhere deep down, you decided that your integrity was worth more than your comfort." As night fell and Sarah eventually left, Ethan remained on the porch with Ranger. The dog was awake now, sitting alert beside his handler, watching the darkness with that eternal vigilance that had kept them both alive through years of danger. "We've come a long way, haven't we, boy?" Ethan murmured. Ranger's tail thumped once against the wooden planks. Ethan thought about that night in the sandstorm, the decision to stop, to help, to sacrifice his own safety for a stranger. At the time, it had felt like the only choice, the obvious thing to do. Now, 6 months later, he understood it differently. That moment hadn't just saved Foster's life. It had saved his own, not physically but spiritually. Because when Webb had tried to destroy him, when the accusations had piled up and the evidence had seemed insurmountable, Ethan had one unshakable truth to hold on to. He knew who he was. He knew he was the kind of person who stopped in a storm, who didn't drive past suffering, who chose compassion over convenience. That knowledge, that certainty of character, had been his armor. Webb could fabricate evidence, coerce witnesses, manipulate the system, but he couldn't change the fundamental truth of who Ethan was. The medal in its case represented that truth, not the heroism of stopping, but the heroism of refusing to be broken afterward. Ethan's phone buzzed one final time. A message from Foster. Ranger's collar has been getting attention. Had 3 people today ask where they could get one for their service dogs. I think you two might have started something. Ethan smiled, scratching behind Ranger's ears. The dog leaned into the touch, eyes half closed in contentment. Looks like you're famous, buddy. Guess we'll have to live with that. Ranger's response was characteristically understated. He yawned hugely, showing all his teeth, then settled down on the porch with a contented sigh. As the stars emerged overhead and the distant sounds of the bass faded into night quiet, Ethan felt something he hadn't felt in years: complete peace. The battles were behind him. The lies had been exposed. The truth had prevailed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: lectures to give, young officers to mentor, a command to help lead. But tonight, sitting on his porch with his loyal companion, Ethan Graves allowed himself to simply exist in the moment. He had survived. He had vindicated. He had proven that integrity, while costly, was ultimately invincible. And beside him, as always, sat the dog who had never doubted him, who had kept a dying woman warm in a sandstorm, who had recognized a judge in a courtroom, who had chosen loyalty over comfort, service over safety. "Thank you," Ethan whispered into the darkness, speaking to the dog and the universe and everyone who had stood by him when standing by him was difficult. Ranger's tail thumped once in acknowledgement. The message was clear: we're soldiers. This is what we do. We don't abandon each other, ever. And as the night deepened and the bass settled into sleep, that truth, simple, powerful, eternal, was enough. It would always be enough. Epilogue: 1 year later. The JAG School auditorium in Charlottesville was filled with newly commissioned officers, bright, eager, convinced of their ability to change the world through military justice. Colonel Foster stood at the podium, her second star gleaming on her shoulder boards, her presence commanding the room. "Today," she said, "I'm introducing you to someone who survived what I hope you'll never face: a complete weaponization of the military justice system by a corrupt superior officer. But more importantly, I'm introducing you to someone who proved that integrity, when tested, can be absolutely unbreakable." Ethan walked onto the stage, Ranger at his side. The dog moved with more deliberation now. Age had slowed him slightly, but his bearing was still proud, still professional. He sat at Ethan's left side, perfectly still, as they'd done in 100 briefings before. For the next hour, Ethan told his story. Not as a victim, but as a witness to what happens when the system fails and what it takes to make it work again. He talked about Webb's manipulation, about the fear and isolation of facing false accusations, about the courage of people like Private Morgan who spoke truth at great personal risk. And he talked about the dog beside him, the loyal companion who had saved his life in combat, who had saved a stranger in a storm, and who had ultimately saved them both by refusing to forget. When he finished, the auditorium was silent. Then, slowly, someone started clapping. Then another. Within seconds, the entire room was on their feet, not because Ethan had asked for applause, but because they understood. They understood that justice wasn't automatic, that integrity had to be fought for, that sometimes the hardest battle wasn't against an enemy army, but against corruption wearing a friendly uniform. After the lecture, a young captain approached Ethan. She had a German Shepherd service dog at her side, similar to Ranger. "Sir, I wanted to thank you. I've been dealing with a toxic commander and I was about to resign rather than fight it, but hearing your story, I think I'm going to stay. I think I'm going to file a complaint through proper channels." Ethan knelt down, eye level with her dog. The shepherd's tail wagged tentatively. "What's his name?" "Scout." "Scout," Ethan repeated, scratching behind the dog's ears. "You've got a good human here. Take care of her." The dog's tail wagged harder, as if understanding. Ethan stood, meeting the young captain's eyes. "It won't be easy. The system doesn't like being challenged. But if you're right, if your complaints are legitimate, then someone needs to speak up. Not for yourself, for the soldiers who come after you. I will, sir, thank you. As she walked away, Foster approached. You're good at this, the teaching thing. I just tell the truth. That's exactly what they need to hear. She looked down at Ranger. How's he doing? Vet says he's got maybe a year or two left. His hips are starting to go, and his hearing in the good ear is fatting, but his spirit's still strong. Foster knelt down, and Ranger immediately moved to her, resting his graying muzzle in her hands. Thank you, she whispered to the dog, for everything. Ranger's tail wagged slowly, a gesture of recognition, of shared history, of bonds forged in crisis and tempered in the aftermath. They had all survived. They had all changed. And the truth they'd fought so hard to defend had rippled outward, touching lives they'd never meet, preventing injustices they'd never know about. That night, driving home through the Virginia countryside with Ranger dozing in the passenger seat, Ethan thought about legacy. Not the medals or the commendations or the lectures, but the simple act of refusing to be broken, of stopping in a storm, of believing that some truths were worth any cost. His phone rang, unknown number. He almost didn't answer, then did. Captain Graves, a young man's voice nervous and hopeful. My name is Specialist Rodriguez. I testified against you during the trial. I lied because Lieutenant Colonel Webb threatened me. Ethan's hands tightened on the steering wheel. I know. I understand why you did it. I wanted to apologize, and to tell you that I'm testifying at Webb's appeal hearing. I'm telling the truth this time, no matter what it costs me. You deserve that much. You don't owe me anything, Rodriguez. Yes, sir, I do. You taught me something important, that some things are more valuable than safety. That integrity matters even when no one's watching, especially when no one's watching. After the call ended, Ethan reached over and rested his hand on Ranger's head. The dog stirred slightly, pressing into the touch without waking. We did good, boy, Ethan whispered. We did really good. And somewhere in the darkness of the Virginia night, beneath the stars that had witnessed countless human struggles and triumphs, that simple truth resonated. They had stopped in a storm. They had refused to break. And in doing so, they had reminded the world that heroes weren't the ones who never fell. They were the ones who got back up, who told the truth, who kept faith even when everything suggested faith was foolish. The road stretched ahead, dark and uncertain. But Ethan drove it with confidence now, with his loyal companion beside him, both of them marked by their battles but not defined by them. They were survivors. They were soldiers. And their story of courage, loyalty, and the unbreakable bond between a man and his dog would echo through military courtrooms and barracks and briefing rooms for years to come, reminding future generations that justice, while sometimes delayed, was always worth fighting for. Always. The end.